He was the diplomat who made rooms fall silent when he spoke, the poet whose words moved hearts across England, a man so brilliant he mastered French, Latin, and Italian, who charmed kings and commanded Dover Castle. But most of all, a boy who adores his elder sister, his mentor, the Queen of England. And now they accuse him of sleeping with her. His own wife gave testimony against him. His own uncle sits in the judge's seat. His father watches from among the peers who will condemn him. The people who bowed to him last week now stare as if he's diseased. George Boleyn knows he's going to die. His sister Anne has already been found guilty. The jury is sold. But he has one weapon left: his words, his devastating eloquence. He has to speak, not to save his life, but to save something more important: his reputation, his sister's innocence. If he doesn't fight back now, history will brand them sinners for crimes that never happened. So when they hand him a note and command him not to read it aloud, George makes a choice that seals his fate but reclaims his dignity. He reads it anyway. This is the story of a brilliant man trapped in a political game he cannot win, fighting not for his life, but for truth itself.
Welcome back to History Untold. I'm Alex, and together we'll uncover the hidden secrets of the past.
Let me tell you who George Boleyn was before they destroyed him, because you need to understand just how extraordinary this man was to grasp the full tragedy of what happens next. Born around 1504, probably at Blickling Hall in Norfolk, George was the only surviving son of Thomas Boleyn, a man who understood that power lived in royal courts and who raised his children to move in those circles with confidence and skill. George's education was exceptional, even by the standards of wealthy nobility. He learned French so fluently that you'd think he was born in Paris rather than Norfolk. Latin rolled off his tongue with the ease of a scholar. Even Italian, which few Englishmen bothered with, came naturally to him. By the age of 11 or 12, he's already serving as one of King Henry VIII's pages, learning how power moves and speaks. By 1528, he's been elevated to a squire of the body, part of the king's intimate inner circle, trusted to be close to the monarch at all times. Then 1529 arrives, and everything accelerates. George is knighted. His father, Thomas Boleyn, is elevated to the title of Earl of Wiltshire, and George inherits his father's former title, becoming Viscount Rochford at just 25 years old. But here's what matters most about George Boleyn. He isn't just decorative. He isn't just another nobleman coasting on his family status. He's genuinely, remarkably useful to the crown. October 1529, George receives his first major diplomatic mission to France. He's being sent to persuade the universities of France to support Henry's divorce from Catherine of Aragon, a delicate, dangerous task that could destroy England's relationship with France if handled poorly. George stays in France for 4 months, and during that time, he doesn't just complete his mission, he builds genuine relationships with King Francis I, one of Europe's most powerful monarchs. He forms a close connection with Margaret of Angoulême, Francis's brilliant, cultured sister, a patron of poets and reformers who would become one of George's key allies in future diplomatic work. 6 more diplomatic missions to France follow over the next several years, each one critical, each one successful. George becomes one of England's most effective ambassadors, trusted with the kingdom's most sensitive negotiations. But diplomacy isn't George's only talent. In 1531, when Henry VIII needs someone to stand before convocation, the English Church's powerful governing body, and argue that the king, not the pope, should be England's supreme religious authority, he chooses George for this nearly impossible task. George is only 26 years old. The men of convocation are older, more experienced, steeped in tradition, and deeply loyal to Rome. They don't take this young nobleman seriously at first, probably expecting him to stumble through prepared remarks and retreat. But George speaks. And when George Boleyn speaks, rooms go quiet. His eloquence is devastating. His arguments are airtight. His presence commands respect even from men who despise what he's saying. On February 11th, 1531, Convocation grants Henry VIII the title Supreme Head of the English Church and Clergy. George has succeeded where many thought success was impossible. His commitment to the Reformation of England continues in Parliament. The Reformation Parliament sits from 1529 to 1536, passing the laws that will sever England from Rome and reshape the nation's religious identity. George's attendance record is extraordinary, 41 sessions out of 46, even while he's abroad for 2 months on diplomatic missions. The average lord attends 22 sessions. George attends 41. This isn't an obligation, this is passion. In 1534, he was made Lord Warden of the Cinque Ports and Constable of Dover Castle. This isn't ceremonial. The Cinque Ports control England's southern coast. Dover is a military fortress. George now has real power. But there's a problem brewing. Thomas Cromwell, Henry VIII's chief minister and the second most powerful man in England, isn't happy about George's rise. We know this because on November 26, 1534, George writes to Cromwell expressing barely contained fury that Cromwell had deliberately undermined one of his orders made in his capacity as Lord Warden. George isn't polite about it. He's confronting Cromwell directly, asserting his authority, refusing to be controlled. George is too independent, too confident, too willing to challenge even Cromwell himself. Cromwell doesn't forget. And there's something else about George that makes him dangerous in Cromwell's eyes. George is also a poet. His contemporaries compare him to Thomas Wyatt and the Earl of Surrey, the finest writers in England. He translates religious texts from French into English, sends them to his sister Anne with dedications calling her the Right Honorable Lady. He also sends her the Lutheran doctrine, risky, dangerous. Henry VIII is still Catholic in everything but name, but George is a reformer. He believes in it. This is the man Cromwell is watching, brilliant, eloquent, connected, independent, passionate about causes that challenge authority, close to the king but not controllable, a poet who understands how words can move hearts, a diplomat who can charm foreign monarchs, a reformer who won't be silenced. George Boleyn is everything Cromwell fears in a rival. April 23, 1536. Everyone at court expects George to receive the Order of the Garter, one of England's most prestigious honors, reserved for the kingdom's greatest nobles. It would be the crown on George's career, the ultimate recognition of his service. The honor goes to Sir Nicholas Kerr instead, a known enemy of the Boleyns, a man who has worked against them at every turn. It's a deliberate insult, a public humiliation. The very next day, April 24th, King Henry VIII orders Thomas Cromwell to set up a special commission to investigate treasons at court. The trap is being set, and George Boleyn, the brilliant poet-diplomat who charmed kings and challenged church councils, is about to walk straight into it.
Let's be clear about what's happening and why a man as brilliant as George Boleyn is about to be caught in a trap he cannot escape. January 1536. Anne Boleyn miscarries a male fetus, and on that same terrible day, King Henry VIII has a serious jousting accident that leaves him unconscious for hours. When Henry wakes up, something fundamental has shifted in his mind. He's been reminded that he is mortal, that death can come for even a king, and he still has no son to secure his dynasty. The fear of vulnerability gnaws at him, the terror that everything he's built might crumble because he cannot produce a male heir. And Henry's already flirting openly with Jane Seymour, one of Anne's own ladies-in-waiting, a quiet woman who represents everything Anne is not. Catherine of Aragon died on January 7th, which means Henry now has something he didn't have before: freedom. With Catherine dead, he can divorce Anne without being forced to return to his first marriage, without having to admit his great matter was a mistake from the beginning. With Anne gone, he can marry Jane, reconciled with Spain and Emperor Charles V, rebuild the alliances that Anne's presence has made impossible. With Anne gone, he can start fresh with a new wife who might finally give him sons. Anne has to go. But removing a queen isn't simple, not even for a king. Thomas Cromwell sees this crisis and recognizes an opportunity that serves multiple purposes. He can remove Anne to satisfy the king's desires and secure the Spanish alliance, yes, but he can also eliminate the entire Boleyn faction in one devastating sweep. Men like George Boleyn, too clever, too eloquent, too influential, too independent-minded. George had the audacity to challenge Cromwell's authority when he undermined George's orders as Lord Warden. George commanded respect in Parliament and at foreign courts. George was a reformer with passionate beliefs and the skills to advance them. Men like George are dangerous when they're not under your control. Cromwell starts interrogating Anne's servants, her ladies, twisting innocent conversations into confessions of adultery and conspiracy. Mark Smeaton, a court musician of humble birth, is arrested first and possibly tortured until he confesses to adultery with the Queen. Then come the arrests of men whose very names should have protected them. Sir Henry Norris, the king's own close friend and groom of the stool, Sir Francis Weston, William Brereton, all accused of sleeping with Anne, all powerful men in their own right, all now pawns in Cromwell's larger scheme. And then there's George, whose charge is deliberately different, deliberately more horrifying than the others: incest. The word itself makes people recoil. Cromwell claims George had sexual relations with his sister on multiple occasions, November 2nd, 1535 at Westminster and other times at Whitehall. The specificity of the dates is meant to lend credibility, to make the unthinkable seem documented and real. It's absurd when you stop to think about it. George and Anne are siblings who grew up together, who supported each other's ambitions, who shared a passion for religious reform. Anne was like a mentor to him, pushing him to excel, to use his gifts. They were close, yes, but that's what siblings who respect each other are. Except Cromwell understands something about human psychology, how to take normal behavior and recast it as sinister. Siblings spending time together becomes suspicious. Anne laughing at George's wit becomes inappropriate intimacy. George visiting Anne's chambers to discuss politics or books becomes proof of illicit desire. Normal sibling loyalty twisted into something grotesque. And here's where the betrayal cuts deepest, where George must have felt the ground disappear beneath him. His wife, Jane Parker, provides testimony to the investigators. We don't know exactly what she said, and historians still debate whether she testified willingly or under unbearable pressure from Cromwell's men. But there are strong hints that she discussed private conversations between George and Anne, possibly including Anne's comments about the king's sexual inadequacies, his potential impotence, and his failures as a husband. Whether Jane intended to destroy her husband or was simply terrified into cooperation, the result is the same. George is now isolated completely, betrayed by the woman who should have been his closest ally, abandoned by the person who knew him most intimately. The brilliant diplomat who could charm French kings and debate with scholars now stands alone, surrounded by enemies, with even his own wife's words turned against him. May 1st, 1536, May Day at Greenwich Palace. There's a jousting tournament, one of those grand spectacles where nobility displays martial skill and the court pretends everything is normal. George is one of the principal jousters, riding out before the crowd, performing his role as if the world isn't collapsing around him. The crowd cheers, the lances crack against shields. Everything looks normal on the surface. But Henry leaves suddenly, without explanation, riding for Westminster as if something urgent has called him away. Those watching understand. When a king abandons festivities like this, something terrible is about to happen. George must have known. He must have felt the dread settling in his stomach, the certainty that his time has run out. May 2nd, 1536. George is arrested at Whitehall Palace. His sister Anne has already been taken to the Tower that very morning, and now, within hours, George joins her there, imprisoned in the same fortress where their family's greatest triumph, Anne's coronation, took place just 3 years earlier. Sir Henry Norris, Sir Francis Weston, William Brereton, Mark Smeaton, all imprisoned as well. The trap is complete.
Friday, May 12, 1536, Westminster Hall. The four men accused of adultery with Queen Anne Boleyn stand trial before their peers, knowing that the verdict has already been written in Thomas Cromwell's careful script. The evidence presented is painfully thin. Hearsay, misinterpreted glances, servants' gossip twisted into testimony of treason. There are no witnesses to any actual act of adultery, no letters confessing love, no caught embraces, just rumors and innuendo elevated to the level of legal proof. But the jury finds all four men guilty anyway, because that's what was required of them, what was expected, what Cromwell had arranged. This verdict matters enormously for what comes next. If Anne committed adultery with four different men, then in the twisted logic of the court, George's charge of incest becomes more believable. If Anne is promiscuous enough to betray the king with multiple men, surely she's depraved enough to lie with her own brother. The verdicts are predetermined, the outcome never in doubt. Cromwell has orchestrated this carefully, and Eustace Chapuis, the imperial ambassador who watches everything with sharp eyes, will later reveal that Cromwell openly admitted he went to great trouble arranging this entire plot to remove Anne Boleyn through charges of adultery and incest. It was political from the beginning. An alliance with Spain required Anne's removal, and Cromwell delivered what the king needed while also eliminating his own rivals. Monday, May 15, 1536. Anne's turn comes in the morning. She's tried in the same hall before the same kind of jury, with her own uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, presiding over her condemnation. The evidence against her consists of the confessions of the four men already condemned, particularly Mark Smeaton's confession, extracted under what was almost certainly torture. The verdict surprises no one who understands how power works in Henry VIII's England. Guilty on all counts. Anne Boleyn, Queen of England, crowned just 3 years ago with such ceremony and hope, will die within days. A few hours later, in the afternoon, Westminster Hall fills again for George's trial. 26 peers of the realm sit in judgment, men who were supposed to be George's equals, but who will decide whether he lives or dies. The Duke of Norfolk, George's own uncle, his mother's brother, presides over the proceedings again, his face revealing nothing of whatever he might feel about condemning his nephew. The courtroom is absolutely packed with observers. Everyone wants to witness this, the spectacular fall of the Boleyn family, the brother of the Queen accused of something so unspeakable that even hardened courtiers whisper about it in hushed voices. The charges are read aloud in careful legal language that cannot disguise their horror. Incest with Queen Anne Boleyn on multiple occasions, high treason against the crown, plotting with Anne to murder the king so they could rule together. The room goes completely silent as the final charge is read, as if everyone has stopped breathing at the same moment. George Boleyn stands alone before them. In treason trials, there is no lawyer to speak for you, no advocate to present your case, no witnesses you can call to defend you. The accused has nothing except their own words, their own ability to argue for their life. But George Boleyn has always been exceptionally good with words, and everyone is about to be reminded why he was such a successful diplomat. He begins speaking, and his voice is clear and steady, not trembling with fear, not the voice of a guilty man scrambling desperately for mercy, but the voice of someone who knows their innocence and intends to prove it through logic and eloquence. George dismantles the prosecution's case systematically, piece by careful piece, using the same skills that made him successful in negotiations with French kings and in debates before convocation. Where is the actual evidence of these crimes, he demands. What the court has presented is hearsay, servants' gossip, rumors, conversations misunderstood or deliberately misinterpreted. There are no love letters between him and Anne, no witnesses to any inappropriate act, no physical evidence of any kind. Who are the witnesses who saw these alleged crimes, he asks. Where are the people who can testify under oath that they witnessed incest or conspiracy? The answer is devastating in its simplicity. There are none. Not a single person testifies against George in this courtroom. Not one witness appears to describe what they saw or heard. This is absolutely extraordinary, and everyone present knows it.
In serious criminal cases, especially in charges of treason that carry the death penalty, witnesses always appear. They give detailed testimony, they can be questioned, their credibility can be challenged. But not here, not today, because there are no witnesses, because there is no evidence, because the entire case is built on fabrications and twisted interpretations of innocent behavior. George points all of this out with devastating clarity, his eloquence cutting through the prosecution's carefully constructed lies. The French ambassador, Lancelot de Carles, watches in amazement. Later he writes, "One never saw a man respond better. No one with such an abundance of eloquence and knowledge. George is brilliant, and everyone in Westminster Hall can see it." Eustace Chapes, observing for the Holy Roman Empire, reports something stunning. Several men in the crowd start placing bets. 10-1 odds that George will be acquitted. 10-1. His defense is that powerful. Charles Wriothesley, the court chronicler, writes that George's testimony was a marvel to hear. For a moment, just a brief flickering moment, it seems possible. George might walk out of here alive. But here's something crucial that many people don't know. George wasn't even in the country for most of the dates when he supposedly committed incest with Anne. He was on diplomatic missions, in France, negotiating for England. The prosecution knows this. The jury knows this. It doesn't matter, because this trial isn't about evidence. It's about power. And then something happens that changes everything. A servant approaches George, hands him a piece of paper. It's a written statement, allegations about conversations between Anne and George's wife, Jane. The subject? The king's sexual inadequacies, possibly impotence, possibly his inability to satisfy a woman in bed. George is given explicit instructions. Do not read this aloud. The court wants to protect Henry's dignity, his reputation. George looks at the paper. He looks at his uncle sitting in judgment. He looks at the 26 peers who will decide his fate. He already knows the verdict. Anne was found guilty hours ago. The other men were found guilty days ago. George Boleyn is going to die no matter what he does next. So, he makes a choice. He reads the note aloud. Every word, every humiliating detail about the king's sexual failures. The courtroom erupts. Gasps, murmurs of shock, scandalized whispers. George has just committed the ultimate defiance. He's exposed Henry VIII's most private shame in open court. Why would he do this? Because he's already condemned. Because the trial is a farce. Because he wants everyone in that room to see exactly what kind of charges are being used to destroy him and his sister. Because if he's going to die, he'll die speaking truth, not cowering, not begging, standing tall. This is the moment George Boleyn reclaims his dignity. Even as they strip everything else away, he chooses how he'll be remembered. Thomas Wyatt, the poet and diplomat who knew George well, later wrote, "Some say, Rochford, hadst thou not been so proud, for thou great wit, each man would thee bemoan. Since it is so, many cry aloud, it is a great loss that thou art dead and gone." Proud. That's the word. George was proud. And in that moment, reading that note aloud, he showed exactly what that pride meant. The jury deliberates. All 26 peers vote. Guilty. Unanimous. The verdict was decided before George ever entered the courtroom. The jury had been paid off. Cromwell made sure of it. The sentence is pronounced. Hanged,
drawn and quartered at Tyburn, the most brutal death England reserves for traitors. Your body is cut down while still alive. Your entrails are removed while you watch, your body quartered. George hears this without flinching. Later, we don't know when, Henry commutes the sentence. George will be beheaded instead. A mercy. But mercy from whom? From the king who ordered his death? From the friend who betrayed him? George is taken back to the Tower of London. He has 2 days left to live.
May 15th through May 17th. George sits in his cell, but he's not silent. He's not resigned. He's worried about his debts. This detail matters. It reveals something about George's character. He asks that his confiscated assets be used to pay what he owes. He doesn't want anyone to suffer because of his death. His distress about this is so acute that Sir William Kingston, the constable of the Tower, writes to Cromwell twice, begging him to ease George's conscience. Think about this. George is facing execution in days. He knows he'll die. He knows it's unjust, and he's worried about his creditors. Does this sound like the evil schemer from popular fiction, the manipulative villain from The Other Boleyn Girl? Or does it sound like a man of honor, trying to do right by people even in his final hours? May 17th, 1536, morning. George is taken from his cell, led to Tower Hill. Not Tyburn, a small mercy. Tower Hill is more private, more dignified for nobility. But there's still a crowd. Executions are public events. 4 other men are already there. Sir Henry Norris, Sir Francis Weston, William Brereton, Mark Smeaton. He was the first to be executed. He climbs the scaffold. The wood is dark with blood. Tradition allows the condemned to make a final speech. George takes full advantage. His scaffold speech is long, detailed, eloquent. For us to have such a complete record of it, the crowd must have been nearly silent, hanging on every word. This was not a normal execution. George speaks carefully. There are rules. It's dishonorable to deny your guilt once a court of law has condemned you, so George skirts the edge. He begs forgiveness from anyone he might have offended. He begs God's forgiveness as a sinner deserving of death. He speaks passionately about his religious beliefs, his commitment to reform, his faith. And then he says this, quote, "Beware, trust not in the vanity of the world, or the flatteries of the court, or the favor and treacheries of fortune." Unquote. Read that again. He's saying he'd be alive if he hadn't trusted his fortune, if he hadn't trusted the court, not his guilt. His luck ran out. This is as close as anyone in Tudor England could get to declaring innocence once condemned. Everyone listening understands what he's really saying. I am innocent. The court lied. But I cannot say those words directly, or I dishonor myself. So George Boleyn, master diplomat, finds another way. He submits his neck to the block. No panic, no pleading. The executioner raises the axe. One strike. George Boleyn dies at approximately 32 years old. Diplomat, poet, reformer, friend to kings, dead because his sister became queen, dead because Thomas Cromwell saw him as a threat, dead because he was, in Thomas Wyatt's words, too proud to beg. 2 days later, May 19th, Anne follows him. A French swordsman beheads her with a single stroke. The Boleyn family is destroyed in less than 3 weeks.
Here's what we know for certain. Thomas Cromwell later admitted to Eustace Chapuis that he arranged the entire plot. He went to great trouble to remove Anne Boleyn through charges of adultery and incest. The goal? An alliance with Spain. Anne was the obstacle. The jury that convicted George was paid off before they entered the courtroom. We know this. It's documented. The trial was theater. The verdict predetermined. And yet George Boleyn is remembered as guilty, as the brother who committed unspeakable acts with his sister. Fiction has done this. The Other Boleyn Girl,
the Tudors TV series. They present George as a villain, or at best, a tragic fool. But look at the evidence. A man who attended Parliament more faithfully than almost any peer, who argued for religious reform when it could cost him everything, who translated banned Lutheran texts and sent them to his sister, knowing the risk, who, in his final moments, worried about his debts, about people he owed money to, who faced death with eloquence and dignity, speaking truth as close as Tudor law allowed. That's not a villain. That's a man of principle, destroyed by a corrupt system. Henry VIII married Jane Seymour 11 days after Anne's execution. The court moved on. New faces, new favorites. Henry rewrote history. Anne was wicked. George and the others were traitors. It was convenient, tidy. It was a lie. George's poetry is lost. His diplomatic achievements largely forgotten. Even his birthday remains unknown. He's remembered as Anne Boleyn's brother. Nothing more. But his story matters. It shows how power corrupts absolutely, how innocent people are destroyed when they threaten those in authority, how a brilliant, talented man can be erased from history and replaced with slander. And it shows that even facing certain death, even when everything is lost, some people refuse to surrender their dignity. George Boleyn stood in Westminster Hall and read that note aloud, knowing it sealed his fate. He climbed the scaffold on Tower Hill and spoke truth disguised as humility. He died on his own terms, speaking, defiant, unbroken. 500 years later, we're still talking about him, not as the monster fiction created, but as the man he actually was, a diplomat too good at his job, a reformer too passionate for his beliefs, a brother too loyal to his sister, and a human being who deserved better than what history gave him. That's not a footnote. That's a legacy worth remembering.
So here's my question for you. If you had been in that courtroom watching George's defense, knowing what you know now about Tudor politics, would you have believed he was innocent? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I genuinely want to hear your perspective. And if you enjoyed uncovering George Boleyn's true story, please hit the like button and click this video to explore another untold history story that deserves to be heard. Thank you for watching.